I enjoyed the one on abortion with Callum the other night, Jonathan. It was good.
Yep, me too. I really enjoyed that one.
He said that you have well, I can't remember what relation he said, but that you've got the Scottish Surgeon General, or is that right? Was in a member of your family? No, what was it?
Oh no, Jonathan, you know the guy David, your friend David.
Oh, you mean David Galloway? He's a friend of mine.
David Galloway. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Right. Oh, family friend. Right. Oh, okay. I've met David Galloway. Yeah.
He's a top guy.
Yeah,
I met
he's
him
a
at
great
Jonathan's
guy.
stag do.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he's really good guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, just go. So, Jonathan, will questions be coming up on YouTube and also on the panel? On the panel here as well?
That's the plan, yeah.
Okay, great.
So I've sent you guys the link for the YouTube live stream.
It seems to just go to a question, a Google search rather than the live stream. Let me just see if I can find it.
It works for me.
Okay, so we've got that's working now. Great. And Jonathan, will the opinion poll just work in the background? We're not going to be kind of interacting with that at all?
That's correct.
Right, cool. Okay, Sarah's on, Jonathan. If you could let her in, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. So people can submit questions by hitting the Q&A button on their screen.
Hello.
Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Max.
Hey, Sarah.
Hello, David.
How you doing, my friend?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good, thanks.
Good.
Great. Got a first question coming in.
Start video. There we go.
Jonathan, is the YouTube normally about a few seconds lag? Is that?
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, cool. Great. Cool. Sarah, are you doing well?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, thanks. It's been a great day. They said it was looking to rain here, but it hasn't rained yet. So,
yeah, a nicer day than they thought.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Sarah, you met Jonathan before, haven't you?
I've seen Jonathan. I haven't been speaking with him as yet.
No,
Cool.
we haven't met before, but great to meet you.
Yeah.
Sarah, you weren't able to be at the Atkins debate, were you? I think Jonathan was there that night, so that was when he was in town. So yeah.
I've heard a lot about it though. I've heard that you fared much better than your opponent.
Well, if you see the Q&A, you'll have a good Saturday night in. That'll be it's a fantastic little 38 minutes out. Hey, Callum, how you doing?
Hey, not bad, thanks. You?
Very good, thanks. Yeah.
Good.
Good stuff, guys. So just a quick one before we kick off in a few minutes. I'm going to kind of semi-host tonight, not in a formal capacity, but I'll just do an intro, and then if you guys could just intro yourselves, and I'll just share a bit about myself as well. And then we'll just go straight into the first question. We've got, I think, a couple come in already, haven't we, Jonathan? So Yeah.
Got a nice beard during lockdown, Callum.
Yeah, this was just shaving since yesterday.
Wow. That's one day's growth. Look at that.
That was sarcasm.
Sorry, there must have been a lag on that. Sorry, now I've got the jokes in there. Okay, right. Good stuff. Callum, are you in Oxford, mate?
In London.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. You've all got very similar backgrounds.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd put a green screen up for that.
There's lots
window,
of just like blank, creamy white wall.
Why don't we have
Good
some
to
more
have
interesting
neutral
backgrounds?
Oh, I'll just do a live report from the BBC.
There we go. That's nice.
Nice.
Sorry, news coming right in. Sorry, breaking news. Coronavirus has been ended. Vaccines come in, and we've got a new post there. Cool.
How do you add that to your background?
Oh, go to stop. What you see where it says stop video.
Yeah.
There's a little up arrow to the right of it. If you click on that and then go to choose virtual background.
Oh, okay.
Countdown.
I wish mine actually worked.
When David, when you called me and you had that previous background in the, I honestly no, the one that's like a ski chalet or whatever.
This one.
I completely thought it was your real background.
It is one of my most virtual real ones. I've had many people actually go, "Oh, Dave, where are you, man? You got out early, didn't you? Got out to the Alps." And I was like, "Well, sorry to let you down on this." but yeah, no, it is a very realistic one. It's my friend's chalet in Switzerland, but I wish I was there now. Anyway,
I don't think mine's gonna work. No.
Oh.
I think I'll leave it.
Sit you, Callum.
So
David,
are you at home or?
Sorry, David, what was that?
I was just saying, are you at home in at the usual place?
I am.
Cool. Sorry,
Back
Max.
in Northern Ireland.
David, yeah, I was just going to ask, like, so how is this going to work? Are you going to read out the question and then
Yes.
and then what happens? Like, do we just jump in as
I think Jonathan obviously thought of this one. I think the initial thought is that we treat it in a pretty similar to the reboot kind of style of, I'll read a question out and then go, oh, if it's like specifically on philosophy or something or whatever, then I may say, oh, Max, you want to have a go at that or whatever. Or if you just maybe pipe up and say, I'll jump into this one. It's we want this to be very informal, I think.
That's
Jonathan,
fine. Yeah. No, that's good. I was just going to say the other thing is sometimes what happens at reboot when it's not as well kind of planned is like it goes to every panelist for every
which we
question.
don't want.
Yeah, which is overkill.
Yeah. I think we should probably go for max 2 per, pardon the pun, for each question. If there's a burning thing that, maybe want to add in, then fine. But we don't want to kind of have 5 minutes for each question from every person, 20 minutes.
Sounds good.
Yeah, if that's all right with everyone else, that'd be great.
Sounds good.
Just want to allow for as many questions as possible. Cool. Good stuff. Should we kick off, John?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Guys, well, I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. We're streaming this live question and answer session with some good friends this evening. I'd like to introduce Sarah Stevenson, Dr. Max Baker-Heitch, Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, and Dr. Callum Miller. We're dotted around the world this evening, and we are really looking forward to looking at some of the questions that people have submitted and that we'll have live through the next couple of hours, pertaining to Christianity and maybe facts of the Bible, and any question that you really have around that topic. So it really is an open forum. We'd love everyone to be welcome and feel welcome. And we'd also love any questions to be submitted through the Q&A on the Zoom if you're joining us on webinar, or also the live stream on YouTube. So again, a very warm welcome from myself and David Stretton Downs in Oxford this evening, hosting this conversation. And if the other panelists who are with me this evening could maybe just give a short 30-second introduction, that'd be great. So Dr. Apache.
Absolutely. So I am a Christian apologist and writer, speaker, debater. I finished my PhD in January in the subject of evolutionary biology, studying the origins of the eukaryotic cell cycle. I currently live in Boston, Massachusetts, where I teach molecular biology. So I've been teaching sophomore microbiology this semester. I teach at a Christian college called Sattler College. So that's a little bit about my background in terms of interest. I'm interested in biblical scholarship as well as the scientific defense of the Christian faith as well. So.
Thanks, Jonathan. Dr. Baker-Hodge, Max.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, David. So I am primarily a philosopher. I did my PhD at Oxford University in philosophy, finished that in 2014. I then held a couple of junior academic posts. One was at Oxford, and then the next was at University of Notre Dame. And I now teach philosophy at Wycliffe Hall as part of Oxford University, and I also lecture at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics.
Fantastic, thank you, Max. Sarah Stevenson.
Hello, my name's Sarah. I'm from Northern Ireland. Did my Bachelor of Education degree at Belfast Queen's University. I'm now studying my MSc through Edinburgh University in Philosophy of Science and Religion. I'm also a head of department here in Northern Ireland at Grammar School of Religious Studies. And I very much enjoyed learning at the course that Max talked about in the Oxford Christian Centre this year, which was great.
Fantastic, thanks, Sarah. Great to have you on the panel this evening. And Dr. Callum Miller.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So I'm Callum and I work, well, my background is in medicine. So I studied medicine in Oxford for 6 years and then worked full-time in the NHS for a couple of years and now part-time in the NHS. At the same time, I teach a little bit at the University of Oxford where I teach philosophy and ethics. And then the rest of my time, which is still a long time, I work also with the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, looking at difficult questions about Christianity.
Thanks, Callum. And yeah, before we move on, I'll just introduce myself briefly as well. David Stratton Downs did an undergraduate degree in design, actually, at Loughborough University many moons ago. But since then, I've been studying apologetics in different forms, and most recently at Oxford, the Oxford Centre of Christian Apologetics. Also, following on from that, run and host a talk show called The Inside Story, where we look at the big questions in life and look at endeavour, truth, and ideas with different thinkers and creatives around the world. So it really is great to be joining this group of people for what we hope to be a special evening, where we look into some of these questions. And we already have a number of questions coming in from the audience. We have some that have been pre-sent through, and we're going to kick off just now, actually, with the first question. So first one is, and just to be very clear as well this evening, it's a very informal evening for everyone. There will be different panelists jumping in on different questions, and there is truly no question off limit. So really do feel free to ask your question in the chat, on the Q&A, or on the live stream. So we're going to kick off. So why would God send good people to hell just because they do not accept the gospel? So I don't know if anyone wants to kick off with that. If you do, just maybe jump in now.
Well, I would say to that it's not so much the belief content per se that determines one's eternal destiny. It's not that one is subject to God's judgment or God's wrath in the afterlife as a result of they had the wrong set of beliefs per se. Rather, it is as a consequence of sin, because the Bible teaches that God is holy, meaning that he's maximally just, and pure and righteous, and therefore God cannot acquit the guilty. He should be condemned while retaining his just nature, because justice prescribes that they receive justice for the sins that they have committed. So in a court of law setting, someone who is guilty of a crime cannot be just acquitted by the judge because they've broken the law, and so the judge is legally obliged to pass sentence. So likewise, I think with God, because he is maximally just, he even more so is committed to passing a just sentence. However, in the person of Christ, God stepped into human history. He broke into time itself and walked among us in the person of Jesus Christ. And having lived a perfectly righteous life and being not guilty of any sin himself, of any crime himself, he went to the cross, and on that cross of Calvary, he, being the God-man, being fully God and fully man, basically took our place as a substitute, that he exhausted the full extent of God's wrath in our stead, so that if we trust in his sacrifice upon the cross, if we trust in what he has done, not trusting our own goodness, our own meritorious works, but trusting instead in the perfect work of Christ and his sacrifice upon the cross, then we can be acquitted, because Christ has drunk the cup of God's wrath, of his fury, in our place. And so to summarize that, it's not so much the belief content, but rather God has offered a way by which we can be made right with him through the death of his son, Jesus Christ, upon the cross. And so it's only by trusting in that, in that sacrifice, that we can be reconciled to a holy God and enjoy eternity of fellowship with him. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
Cool. Well, we'll kick off with the next question. We had this question here has been sent in previously, and so it's, I'm just going to read it out now for us to reflect on. So how do you respond when, quite rightly, you point out that not only does Scripture prescribe marriage as being between a man and a woman, but also that almost always when it describes polygamy, it doesn't fare well? One might cite both as being evidence for God's intent for marriage as being per the Genesis 2 model, and then someone comes back with 2 Samuel 12:8. What do you say? For those panelists, it's also on the chat, so you can read that as well to reflect on. This one's coming from YouTube, hasn't it, Jonathan? Possibly. Don't know if anyone wants to have a thought on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, which may possibly is the reason for a bit of silence. It's not to say the question's wrong or anything. It's just I'm not exactly sure what's being got at. I'd also, I think, need to read 2 Samuel 12:8.
Maybe we'll come back to that question. If we can look at that 2 Samuel 12:8, and then we'll come back to that one. Thank you so much to that person who's put that question in. Or, as I said, all questions are wholly valid, and we're. Could we cut back on the talk, please? So just continuing on that, the question there, the next question we're going to look at is, does anyone have any thoughts on the fact that people could apparently live for several hundred years in early Genesis?
So I have some thoughts on that. I don't know whether my perspective on this is shared by all panelists, so maybe other people could weigh in as well. But my personal perspective is that the ages in Genesis 5 are symbolic rather than literal. I think there's some strong evidence to that effect. For example, so when God promises Abraham a son, he expresses credulity that he can have a son when he is 100 years old. And his own father, Terah, apparently had him when he was 130 years old. So that to begin with suggests that we might not be necessarily looking at literal numbers. Furthermore, God promises Abraham that he'll live to a good old age, and he dies around 175 years old, according to the biblical narrative. But 175, actually, if you take the ages in Genesis 5 and 11 literally, is actually tragically young to die. And so it wouldn't make so much sense for God to say that you'll live to a good old age. Furthermore, the long lifespans that are given in Genesis 5 are the vast majority of them. So there's 30 numbers that are given, and the vast majority of them are divisible by 5, with a few exceptions. And most of the remaining numbers that are not divisible by 5 become divisible by 5 when you subtract 7, and so that, in my opinion, is statistically unlikely, and so it points to these numbers might not be intended to be understood literally. Furthermore, we have precedent for numbers being used symbolically in the ancient world, including in biblical narratives. For instance, in Matthew's genealogy, in Matthew chapter 1, Matthew mentions 14 generations between Adam and David, or between Abraham and David, 14 generations between David and the exile, and 14 generations between the exile and Christ. But he has to duplicate and skip genealogies in order to make the math work. And so he's using the number 14 in the symbolic way, because 14 is the mathematical is the numerical value of David's name, and he's trying to represent Jesus as the greater David. So I could go on. There's actually quite a number of papers that have been published making the case for a non-literal understanding of the numbers in Genesis 5. There also the Sumerian Kings list is also further evidence that the ancients often used these sorts of numbers in a symbolic way rather than a literal way. In the Sumerian Kings list, you have a list of pre-flood and post-flood kings, and the length of their reigns is given in the order of tens of thousands of years, and it's very unlikely that was intended to be understood literalistically. So that's what I'd say on that particular point. I don't know if anyone else has alternative perspectives on that in the panel.
I was actually going to talk about the King's List. So all I'd add on that actually is that in Oxford, where many of us have lived or worked in the last year, they actually have one of the copies of the Sumerian King List in the Ashmolean Museum. So if you ever visit Oxford, you can go and see a copy. And as Jonathan says, there seems to be a kind of stopping point in the middle of history where after the flood, the lifespans reduce significantly. I guess I'd be in agreement with Jonathan that I don't think this was intended to represent literal kind of lengths of lives. The question then is just, well, then what does it mean? And I think the honest answer that probably most people would give is we just don't know, which in some ways is unsatisfactory. But on the other hand, God never promised that we would understand literally everything in the Bible. And actually, it would be kind of impressive if everything in the Bible was readily understood by everyone. I think God doesn't always give us all the answers we might be interested in, or he doesn't always give us every single answer that we might want to know. And the reason for that is that God is not a textbook. God is a person who we're supposed to know in relationship. And just as in the same way you trust your parents or you trust your friends without knowing every single thing about them, or without knowing everything about how they act or every reason for what they do, nevertheless, because they're a person who's shown their goodness to you, you can generally trust them even without having all the answers. And so, yeah, like I say, I don't think anyone really knows exactly what is meant by those. Perhaps scholarship will come up with an answer in the next few years. We don't know. Often biblical scholarship does come up with new answers from archaeology that do shed light on these things. And it might well be that we do understand this much better in future years. But ultimately, there are some things we don't know at present. But that's not an issue. It's something that we can still trust God with.
Thanks, Callum and Jonathan, for that. Next
David.
question. Sorry.
David, I would maybe just go back to the last question about the relationships of the Old Testament in comparison to what seems to be demanded of us. Is that okay if I maybe just go back to that question? David seems to have frozen, so I'll just go ahead here. Well, just having had a bit more time in lockdown, I've actually been reading through some of these books, and maybe giving the female perspective can help, because when you read these Old Testament books, and for instance, King David, who he had different women that weren't Bathsheba, and yet when Solomon is being questioned, he's being actually compared to the ethic of David, where it literally says David only committed the error of Bathsheba. So this week in lockdown, I have literally been saying, what is going on? How can there be in the Old Testament that it is actually, it seems that it's not going against some sort of agreed ethic that men do have multiple women, so long as they don't belong to another man. And I would have to say, as a woman reading that, I personally do find that confusing. I think that, as Callum said it in the last question, I do think there are reasons that go beyond my understanding as to why men are allowed to have multiple women and women are in that position. But the other thing that I balance that uncertainty with is God is perfect. His way of dealing with us, who as a human race, is he has progressed us. And so when I look as to where he takes the human race in the New Testament, he brings us to this picture of a man and a woman together in this picture of marriage. And whenever I think to question God's heart for women, I think to myself, well, look at Jesus. You know, he interacted with women, he taught them, he included them. He very much wanted them to be his disciples. He validated this egalitarian spirit. And so whenever I'm in doubt, that's what I turn to, even though there's a bit of uncertainty about that ethic.
Yeah, if I could just add, I guess on that, I had a quick chance to read 2 Samuel 12:8, where God says that he gave wives to David. And presumably the thought behind the question is, God in this case seems to be giving someone multiple wives. And is this kind of in accordance with what God apparently teaches about monogamy? I haven't looked into this area in huge depth, but just one thing that I'd say that I think is broadly true across the Old Testament is that God in general hasn't always brought people to an immediate understanding of his will for the created order. And actually, this is especially so in the case of marriage. Now, I think in Genesis, where it does talk about God creating a man and a woman for each other, I think it does set out the ideal. But of course, throughout history, humans have lost that ideal. And they've, for whatever reason, through sin or whatever, they have kind of gone through things that have been bad for families, bad for marriages, bad for women, bad for children, and so on. And so once that kind of fall had occurred, and once sin is kind of brought into the world, you then have a situation where the created order has already been disrupted, and people across the ancient Middle East did kind of live in ways that weren't in accordance with how God intended us to live. And one of the clearest ways was in the way that they married. For example, the very liberal laws on divorce that allowed men essentially to just divorce women for no reason and to send them away completely vulnerable and essentially without any material support in any way. And of course, the issue of polygamy. Now, what I think the Bible does tell us a bit more clearly is that when you get to the New Testament, Jesus actually looks back on some of the law in the Old Testament, and he said, actually, God did allow some things that were not part of his created order because of the hardness of your hearts. And so he explicitly says, for example, Moses allowed divorce for reasons that God doesn't think really divorce should be permissible for, because essentially God was kind of meeting the Israelites halfway. He was saying, I understand that, you know, things are difficult for you, and I understand the context you're from, and I'm not immediately expecting you to get back to a point of kind of moral perfection. And so I think the same is probably true in the case of polygamy, or something like that is true, where monogamy has been God's intention for the created order from the beginning, and I think that is reflected in Genesis. Humans fell away from that, and the ancient world was therefore completely broken in many ways, including through polygamy, and through very liberal divorce laws that left women and children vulnerable, and so on. And God didn't immediately bring them back to the absolute place of perfection by expecting them to 100% live according to his created order straight away. He accommodated their culture, their context in various ways, while at the same time pointing towards the person who would fully reveal God's heart and God's intention again, which is Jesus. And so when Jesus comes, he fully reflects and fully reveals God's intention for marriage, God's intention for many other ways that we live and we treat each other. And one example of that is the way Jesus clarifies God's actual intention for marriage and God's actual thoughts on divorce. And again, I think Jesus clarifies that when it comes to monogamy as well. And so there is this sense that in the Old Testament, God does allow some things because of the hardness of our hearts, but that he always points towards the future where things are more clearly revealed. That's not to say the Old Testament is wrong. It's not to say God was misleading people or lying. It's more about God meeting people halfway and meeting them where they're at because of the hardness of their hearts. So that's roughly how I'd approach that sort of question.
Thanks, guys, for that answer. The next question we've got is anonymous attendee. No pressure. The question is, can God create a rock too big for him to lift? Wonder if anyone has some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I'll say something brief. So I guess this is a kind of an old chestnut in philosophy. And the idea is it's supposed to show an incoherence in the concept of an omnipotent being. And there's quite a number of ways that philosophers have thought about this problem. I mean, I could boil it down to this. So I think the first thing to say is, so God can't do the logically impossible. And that's something most philosophers would agree on. There has been the odd philosopher. So Rene Descartes thought that God could make 2 and 2 equal 5 if he'd wanted. But I think there's basically a consensus that God can't do the logically impossible. So God can't create square circles. And that's not because God isn't strong enough to create square circles. It's because a square circle doesn't describe a coherent object. It doesn't describe a coherent state of affairs, so that there isn't anything that God could make when it comes to square circles. So basically, I would take the same approach when it comes to this question of a rock too heavy for God to lift. So the description, a rock too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift, is, I'm suggesting, very much like the description, a square circle. So it's not a coherent state of affairs. So the reason God can't bring it about isn't because he's not strong enough or powerful enough. It's because a rock too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift is not logically coherent, in the same way that a square circle isn't logically coherent.
Thanks, Max. Does anyone else have any additions to that, or should we move on to the next one? Great. Good stuff. The next one we've got has come in from Anna Lee. What does the Bible say about life? When does it begin? I wonder, Callum, if you could maybe kick us off with that one. It's your specialty in ethics.
I'm on mute. I think that's okay now. So what I'd actually say is that this is fundamentally not actually a religious question or a philosophical question. It's a biological question. There was actually a study published 2 years ago now by a researcher at the University of Chicago. And he surveyed a whole bunch of people across the population and said, who is best equipped to judge this question? Is it theologians or philosophers or judges or people voting or biologists? And the overwhelming majority of people said biologists. They think this is a biological question. So what he did was he then surveyed 5,000 or 6,000 biologists and asked them, when does life begin? When is a new human organism created? And what he found actually is what I would have expected from going to medical school, which is that there was actually almost no disagreement about this question. So 95% of biologists effectively said that life begins at fertilization. So the short beginning of the answer is that I'd say it's not ultimately a religious question, it's a biological question. And actually biology is quite clear. When I was in medical school, if I had been asked when life begins, or if I had asked any of my lecturers when life begins, I have no doubt whatsoever that they would have said fertilization. So the science is pretty clear. But given you also asked quite reasonably, what does the Bible say about this? It's worth saying a little bit about that as well. So one of the first things I'd say is that because, of course, they didn't know the science of fertilization in biblical times, the Bible doesn't say life begins at fertilization, and that's pretty clear. But the Bible, nevertheless, is quite clear about life beginning in the womb. So Ecclesiastes talks about God breathing life into people, even in the womb. A lot of the prophets are called in the womb. So Isaiah, I think in Isaiah chapter 1 even, it talks about Isaiah being called and known intimately by God in the womb. And then perhaps most kind of famously, Psalm 139 talks about a human being created in the womb. It says, you knew me in my mother's womb, you knit me together, you formed me, you created me. And one of the most interesting things about that passage is that some people have traditionally tried to say there's a kind of cutoff point within the womb where kind of life begins, and that's to do with the formation of the embryo or the fetus. And so Aristotle, for example, thought that life kind of in some sense began when the embryo was formed into a fetus at maybe 40 or 80 days. What's interesting is that the Bible is aware of this tradition in the Psalms, and it actually uses the word for an unformed substance. So it's talking about a human being before it's been formed even into a recognizable human kind of structure. And even there, the word it uses is golem from Lord of the Rings. Golem is kind of a less than human human. So the Bible talks about this golem, this unformed substance, and says even when there's an unformed substance, God knew us and God kind of saw all our days ahead of us and had a plan for us. And so the Bible kind of necessarily doesn't say life begins at fertilization, because the science of fertilization wasn't known until kind of the 18th or 19th centuries. But the Bible is very clear that life begins in the womb, and it doesn't seem to make a distinction between a formed fetus and an unformed embryo. It seems to say that at all of these points, and it actually talks about the point of conception, at least in some parts of the Bible, it says at all of these points, God knew us intimately and God had a plan for us, and that God loved us and treasured us. So I think the Bible consolidates what we know from science in that respect. And the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition has likewise generally the Jewish tradition has generally agreed with that assessment. The Christian tradition has unanimously pretty much agreed with that assessment.
Thanks, Callum. Does anyone else have anything to add to that, or happy with that? I think we are. That was great. Thanks, Callum. Question come in. Some of you have a PhD, science, history, philosophy. I'm just curious as to how you reconcile your faith with science. E.g., for example, the Bible says the earth is only a few thousand years old, but science clearly says otherwise. Obviously, we've got two sides here. Obviously, the creationists and the young earth creationists and the old earth. I just wonder if we can maybe shed some light into that.
Sure. I'll maybe take this since I have a PhD in science in particular. And I think to ask how you reconcile your faith with your science is really misframe the question. I think really the conflict lies between naturalism and science. I think that science points very powerfully against a naturalistic worldview. I am a theist because I'm persuaded by the scientific evidence, in particular, that God exists. I think there's I think the beauty of the evidences from science that are confirmatory of theistic belief is that it is multidisciplinary. So it's not just limited to one single category of evidence, but you have multiple categories of evidence, or patterns of evidence, if you will, that bear on that question. So for instance, it's only in the last century that we've discovered that the universe, in fact, had a definite beginning. There was philosophical arguments prior to that, but the scientific evidence has caught up with the philosophical arguments in showing that the universe, in fact, had a finite space-time boundary. So Albert Einstein's theory of relativity pointed to the universe having a beginning. In fact, Einstein, because he felt deeply uncomfortable with the notion of or the prospect of a space-time beginning, invoked the cosmological constant, which he later went on to describe as the greatest blunder of his career. It was kind of a fudge factor in his equations to avoid the prospect of a finite beginning sometime in the past. And the evidence in the 20th century began to accumulate that indeed the universe has a beginning. For example, the Hubble telescope showed that Edwin Hubble revealed or observed that the galaxies are moving away from us in every direction at a speed proportional to their distance. And the evidence for that is that the light from these distant galaxies are shifted towards the red end of the spectrum, which is what's known as the Doppler effect, which basically shows that that these galaxies are moving away from us. And so unless we're in the center of the universe, which is very unlikely, it seems that the universe, the space itself is expanding. So that explains the observation that the galaxies in our universe are moving away from us in every direction. Also the second law of thermodynamics, of course, confirms the universe had a beginning, because the second law of thermodynamics is that entropy tends to increase over time, or the amount of disorderliness in the universe tends to increase over time. And so if the universe were eternal in the past, then we'd have already reached a so-called heat death of the universe, where there would be no usable energy left in the universe. And so that also points towards the fact the universe had a beginning. By the way, the fact that the universe are moving away from us, showing that the universe is expanding, reveals that if you were to rewind the tape of life back far enough, you'd come to a point where you have zero spatial volume. And which would be the ultimate beginning of the universe. So various lines of evidence then point to the fact the universe had a beginning, which I think sits far more comfortably with a theistic worldview than a non-theistic worldview. Every worldview ultimately must come back to an unmoved mover, something which didn't begin to exist, but exists necessarily out of the necessity of its own nature. And I think the best candidate explanation for that is God existing trans-temporally, spatially, immaterially. Furthermore, non-spatially and immaterially. Furthermore, if you look at other categories of evidence, we have the fine-tuning of the universe, so the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of our universe and the initial conditions of our universe. For example, the cosmological constant, which determines how rapidly the universe expands, is thought by physicists to be finely tuned. The most popular estimate that's given in the literature is 1 in 10 to the power of 120. So that's on the denominator 1 with 120 zeros after it. If it was slightly off, it was slightly different from that, then now the universe would expand so rapidly you'd only ever get the two lightest elements of hydrogen and helium, or you get a big crunch scenario where the universe collapses in on itself within picoseconds of the Big Bang. And either way, no life can exist in such a universe. Perhaps the most incredible example of fine-tuning of the universe was documented by Roger Penrose, Oxford University, which is which has to do with the initial low entropy conditions of the universe. And according to Penrose, the initial low entropy conditions of the universe is finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. So in the denominator, that's 10 with 123. It is 1 with 123 zeros after, with 10 to the power of 123 zeros after it. So there's not enough particles in the universe to write down the number that big, not even close. There's only 10 to the 80 subatomic particles in the known universe. Final point I'll make on this is the evidence of biological information in biology, which I think points powerfully towards design, because in every realm of experience of the cause and effect chart of the world, we know that information arises solely from intelligent agents, intelligent causes. And when we find information intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA that govern the biology of the cell, I think that we can infer quite reasonably that the best explanation for that is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause. And there's plenty of systems and biological systems which seem to require foresight to bring about, for example, embryonic development and irreducible complex nanotechnology that governs the cell, and something which explains something requiring foresight to bring about cannot be brought about by a stochastic, unguided, mindless process such as natural selection and genetic mutation. I think points towards design as a better explanation. So maybe someone else wants to tackle the age of the Earth aspect of that question, since I've spoken for a little while.
Right.
Well, I'll just say something brief on, I mean, I don't have loads to say about the age of the Earth, except that I do accept that the Earth is, what, 4.5 billion years old. But then I think there was a question about how we square that with the biblical narrative. And I suppose that obviously gets us into a question of what we think the purpose of the biblical narrative is in the early chapters of Genesis. So I think there's lots of things we could say about that. I mean, one thing I think is important to bear in mind here is, so I mean, one way you could come at this is to think about how would it be effective for God to communicate important truths about the character of the cosmos and the human race to a pre-scientific people who can't, the concepts like the Doppler effect and the universe expanding, a Big Bang singularity just won't be able to connect in any way with the conceptual framework of the ancient Israelites. So I would think it would be more effective for God to create to communicate important theological truths with a conceptual vocabulary that the ancient Israelites could understand. And so it doesn't surprise me that the kind of the imagery that we find in the book of Genesis is in some ways quite similar to what we find in other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives, such as the Enuma Elish, so the Babylonian creation narrative. That some of the imagery is similar, but here's what's really important: the biblical creation narrative subverts these other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives in some really important ways. So whereas those other creation narratives will have, the stars and the sun, moon, and stars and so on being deities that are supposed to be worshipped, and human beings are sort of at the bottom of the heap as the kind of slaves of the gods. The Genesis narrative takes much the same kind of images, but sort of flips it on its head and wants to say that, the celestial bodies are just greater and lesser lamps. They're not deities. There's just one God. And that human beings have some kind of very special place in the cosmos to steward creation and so on. And so, and I think just to go back to one point that Jonathan mentioned, that the fact that as modern science now shows the universe did have an absolute beginning, that is a very key point that is affirmed in the Genesis narrative, this idea that the world was created from nothing. In contrast to, as Jonathan said, people like Fred Hoyle in the 60s, an atheist cosmologist who were quite resistant to the Big Bang theory initially because it seemed too friendly to that kind of biblical theistic creation narrative. And so I think in terms of the sort of broad sweep, the fundamental theological claims that are made in the book of Genesis are entirely consistent with modern science. And just to add to that, I suppose I don't think that that it wouldn't be an effective way for God to communicate, to attempt to give to human beings a sort of blow by blow account of the mechanics of how the world was created, to try to give that to a pre-scientific people obviously wouldn't work. And so it doesn't surprise me that we don't find all of those sorts of tiny details that we can marry up with the scientific account.
Thanks, Max.
Max,
Sarah.
can I just come back to you there and say, do you think part of the problem arises when people actually go away from what's revealed in Scripture itself? So, for instance, in Genesis 1, it talks about God making the heavens and the earth, and the Holy Spirit hovered over this. And there's absolutely no indication of time. I mean, to me, when you actually take the Bible maybe more literally than what Christians do, that it sometimes creates those false dichotomies. Whereas if we actually kept to the text, it actually allows for more scope and movement than maybe what we think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think as always with interpreting the Bible is we have to be just sensitive to genre and context. So the way we read the Gospels is quite naturally, or it should be quite naturally, different from the way we read the early chapters of Genesis, because we appreciate that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biography, whereas the early chapters of Genesis are quite different kind of literature. And so, yeah, if we try to rigidly read the entire Bible as if it's one genre, which is sort of akin to modern journalistic reporting, then we're going to run into problems. But I would say that that's just obviously not a good way to approach things.
One final point, just on the age of the Earth issue, is I think really the only point of contention here should be the age of the biosphere, that is, living creatures. Even if you think that the days in Genesis 1 are intended to convey literal 6 literal 24-hour time periods. And the reason for that is, if you look at Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then verse 3 says, and God said, let there be light. It's the first occurrence of the phrase, and God said, which denotes the beginning of each of the creation days in Genesis 1. And so, irrespective of how long you think the days of Genesis 1 are, by the time you even get to the first day of creation week, you already have the heavens and the earth. And I think that's a very plausible interpretation of that text. And so then the question then only really should pertain to the age of the biosphere. I think Scripture is clearly silent on the age of the earth itself. And I personally think that the Hebrew word yom is accurately translated day in an ordinary sense. However, I don't think that's a separate question from whether those yoms of creation week are intended to convey a literal time period or not, or whether it's meant to be taken non-literally. So the days of, so there's 7 days of Genesis 1, and I would argue that again you have numeric symbolism where the number 7 is intended to have symbolic significance, so that would be the sort of approach that I would take on Genesis 1.
Thanks, guys, for that. I might just add one thing, just to wrap up that topic. Obviously, it's a topic that does divide the world, and John Lennox has actually written a very good little book on this. It's something for people to look at if they want to look at further online. Also, there's various things that he's done, and other professors from Oxford as well. So if you want to look at that topic, which is obviously a huge topic to look at, then feel free to look there for a starter. The next question we're going to look at, guys, is what can we say about the different denominations of Christianity? Certainly God isn't a God of confusion. Mostly we're dedicated to the preferred denomination. Please answer directly. So what can we talk about? Maybe someone could talk about maybe how we've come to these different denominations.
Can I just say one comment first, and then maybe somebody can add in about denominations? But I think we have to get to the heart of relationship even before we get to denomination. So when we think about God as Father, Son, and Spirit, and when he makes mankind and invites us into that, the point of being a Christian is to be united with God and with other people. That is why the heart of Scripture is saying, love God and people. And so that is what the church is supposed to be. It is supposed to be the place that emanates the love and the light of God. And so, unfortunately, sometimes, as Callum was saying earlier, he talked about the fall when sin impacts. That also impacts us as Christians, and that can lead to division. It can lead to falsely prioritizing things. You know, we can think, if I don't have my style of music, or if there's this length of a sermon, or if that person's here, you know, sometimes those things creep into churches that create division. But I just want to start off by saying that is not the heart of God. The heart of God is relationship and love, and any false things that you see in church just are not his heart.
I'd say if someone wants to kind of follow on from that, that'd be great. If anyone does.
I guess I'd add that to some extent, having some kind of disagreement is inevitable. And I say that for at least two reasons. One is that people inevitably in a kind of broken world are going to deliberately make mistakes and deliberately mislead people and deliberately interpret things that suit, you know, in ways that suit them. I mean, I'm guilty of this as well. I, in the past, probably even in the present, I've interpreted some of what is quite clear teaching just to basically suit my own ends. And I think probably many of us are guilty of that. And of course, you know, part of the nature of the brokenness of the world is that when we make mistakes, those mistakes don't just kind of apply to us. They don't just have effect on us. I think one of the clearest things we see in the Bible is that when people make mistakes and when they do wrong, that kind of infiltrates throughout the whole world. It has a ripple effect that means that kind of all our mistakes get amplified hugely throughout the world. And so you would expect that people making mistakes in teaching would likewise have ripple effects and would cause much more widespread misunderstandings of things. The second reason I'd say some disagreement is inevitable is that no matter how kind of big your body of agreement is, there's always going to be some extra things about which you might disagree. So even if Christians agreed on everything to do with the age of the earth, to do with the interpretation of the Bible, to do with everything about Genesis or about moral issues, there are going to be questions that they might still disagree on, like how should Christians respond to the coronavirus crisis, which the Bible just doesn't address. And so disagreement is inevitable in some senses for a variety of reasons. But what I'd say is that Christianity has always been pretty clear. And honestly, I don't think needs to be much clearer, if at all clearer, on the real essentials, which is trusting in Jesus and Jesus being the way to relationship with God. Now, obviously, those essentials include a fair bit more depth. There are essentials about who Jesus was and about what he did and how he made a relationship with God possible. But again, I think Christians have always been pretty clear about the nature of that. They've been clear and in complete agreement that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was buried, that he rose again, that God is a Trinity, and so on. And so I guess it's difficult to point to disagreement between Christians and say that's kind of a sign that God has thrown people into confusion, because actually some disagreement is always going to happen no matter what God does. And really the essential thing is that God gives us clarity about the most essential parts and about how to follow him and how to have relationship with him. And ultimately he has been clear about that. He said, to make relationship with me possible, I became a human. I came down to earth through Jesus Christ, died for you and rose again to offer you eternal life. And he says pretty clearly, follow me. Now, like I say, people will still disagree about some of the peripheral elements of what following Jesus looks like. But as I say, the essentials are all there and Christians agree on all the essential things. And so I think in that sense, it's easy to amplify the disagreement and make it look like more kind of central and kind of worrying disagreement than there actually is.
Thanks, Callum and Sarah, for that. Just while we're nearly an hour into the Q&A, guys, just wanted to say that all questions are valid. Please be dropping them onto the live chat on YouTube and also onto the Q&A on the Zoom. We're having tons of questions through, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. next question we're going to look at is, why doesn't God reveal himself to everyone so that everyone will believe in him and no one will go to hell? Maybe my philosophy friends, Max and Sarah, could have a crack at this. It's obviously looking at the divine hiddenness argument. And maybe, Max, you could start off with that.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, why doesn't God kind of give us more evidence? Why doesn't he make himself more obvious? So, I mean, I guess this gets us pretty rapidly into the question of what might God be aiming at. So, so we say, like, well, God would give us strong enough evidence so as to make honest doubt impossible, right? But that depends on what God's aiming at. So I think the biblical picture is, as Callum was just articulating really clearly, the biblical picture of God is that God's overarching aim in terms of human beings is for relationship with humans. Now, so then that leads us to wonder, well, if God wants relationship with human beings, doesn't that mean that God would want us to be unambiguously certain that God's there? And I'd like to suggest that maybe not. So there are two considerations here. So the first one has to do with the power imbalance between us and God. So the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had this little story, or parable, if you like, to kind of illustrate a point here. And so the parable was about a king who fell in love with a maiden, and he wanted to kind of win her. He wanted to win her heart, but he realized that if he made his advance to her in the clear, with her having the clear knowledge that he's the king, that her response would not be one that came out of love necessarily, but could be a response that came out of fear of coercion. And so what this king does is he disguises himself as a peasant and then goes to her and wins her over. And then eventually she learns that he's the king. So the point of that little story is just to say that there's an enormous power imbalance between us and God. And so if God's existence was so evident to us that basically we couldn't doubt it, or we couldn't kind of doubt it and be in our right minds, then the thought is that the level of evidence, that the degree of obviousness of God's existence would be such that it would become really questionable whether our response to God would be one that comes from love, from good motives, or whether it would be at least partly a coerced response. So that's one reason why God's desire for relationship with us might actually not lead God to want to be that overwhelmingly obvious to us. The other thing is that what's key for relationship isn't certainty so much as trust. And in particular, I think, and you know, we can see this to a degree with human relationships. So, you know, when I'm married, when I got engaged to my wife, I wasn't kind of certain, you know, certainly wasn't 100% certain that this was all going to go well, you know, that we were a good match and so on. But so to some degree, I took a risk. Now, obviously, in the case of a human to human relationship, the risk isn't that the person might not be real at all, but the risk is a different sort. It's the risk that, you know, we might not be a great match for each other or something like that. But the point is that I think some of the most significant things we do in life involve us taking a risk in order to show how much we care about that person or that thing. And so when it comes to relationship with God, again, I suggest that actually a way that we get to show how serious we are, how much we care about relationship with God, is that we are willing to take a risk in the sense that we are willing to commit our lives to living in a certain way, despite there being a lack of total sort of 100% certainty. So yeah, I mean, Sarah may want to add some more, but I've just suggested for you there really two reasons why God's desire for a relationship with humans actually might not lead us to expect that God would be so overwhelmingly obvious that we couldn't doubt his existence.
Yes, I think that I just would clarify sort of feels behind the question. There's this assumption that God doesn't want to save some people. There's that doubt, you know, does he reveal himself to some people and not reveal himself to other people? And I personally would totally reject that view. I believe that God loves everyone and loves everyone equally. So that's my belief in God. And therefore, I think that we box God's ability as to how he can relate to people in different ways. Because here in the UK, you can say, oh, well, there's people all around the world and different religions, and, you know, maybe God, you know, is God not connecting? And who are we to box how he is connecting? So for instance, you know, God, we hear people in the Middle East talking about having visions and having dreams, you know, where they've had a dream of Jesus and they're led to someone and they're led to someone else. I just think that we restrict God as to how he can connect to people. So personally, I would very much encourage him, and has many different ways to you. Sometimes we just close our imagination for how much he actually wants to be a part of our lives.
Thanks, Sarah and Max, for that. The next question, we're going to move on. It's basically, thank you so much for the questions that are coming in, by the way. None of them are, they're all great. And the question that we're going to go to next is, how can we best argue for biblical inerrancy? Are there any good reasons to think that the Bible is the inspired word of God? And maybe Jonathan, you could kick us off with this. I know this is an area that you've spoken on a lot in the past months.
Sure. On the topic of inerrancy, I would make a distinction between what I would call a priori inerrancy and what I would call inductive inerrancy. A priori inerrancy can be defined as a rigid dogmatic commitment to there can be absolutely no errors in Scripture. The other view, inductive inerrancy, is closer to my own perspective, which is that I'm not rigidly committed to there being no errors. However, I have not found any errors. I've not been convinced to my satisfaction that there is an error in Scripture. So that's a distinction that I would draw. On the a priori inerrancy view, I would see that perspective on Scripture as having quite a brittle view of Scripture, where if you were to show a single mistake or error on any point of detail in Scripture, then that would shatter the edifice of the Christian faith. And I just don't buy that. On the view of inductive inerrancy, I remain open to the possibility that there could be errors in Scripture without it necessarily refuting or shattering the edifice of the Christian faith. I also draw a distinction between what I call an error, which is the result of a deliberate distortion of fact, and an error which is a result of what one might call good faith. So a good faith error is where an author, because of a lapse in memory or some other reason, has made an honest mistake, even though that particular author is habitually truthful and a reliable reporter and so forth. I think that the category of errors known as good faith errors are much less epistemically problematic than deliberate distortions of fact. Because if an author is willing to make deliberate distortions of fact, then you might question, well, where else has he made a deliberate distortion of fact? I think that we can show that the Gospels and Acts and the New Testament more generally, and I think you can also make arguments to this effect in regards to the Old Testament as well, is that the authors are close up to the facts, and that they are habitually trustworthy, habitually reliable, and that they have reliable sources of information. and that the Gospels get very particular details right on numerous occasions, and as documented in multiple categories of evidence, such as incidental corroborations in extra biblical sources, as well as undesigned coincidences and so forth, which corroborate very specific details. And so that provides then an inductive basis for trusting these documents to be, as a whole, reliable documents, substantial reliability. And so even if we were to find some good faith errors in Scripture, I think that at most would only would not undermine significantly the arguments for the substantial reliability of the Gospels. So there are a few, there's a handful of cases in the Gospels where I think one can make a plausible argument for the presence of a good faith mistake. I've got those at my fingertips if anyone wants to discuss them. But I think irrespective of whether these actually are errors, I think you can still make an argument that the Gospels as a whole are trustworthy, and therefore, if the Gospels assert something, then you have an inductive basis for that being prima facie evidence for the veracity of that particular event or detail. Does anyone have anything to add to that, or disagreements with what I've said that they want to air?
Thanks, Jonathan. We're going to move on to our next question. We've had a number of questions in from Nathan. Thanks so much for persisting with us. We've got so many questions come in, but yours has come to the top now. So it's we're going to kick off with your first one, and then the panelists, we may direct some of those later on. If we don't get time to go through them all, I'm sure if you email myself, I can pass them on and we can get back to you, no problem. But the first one we're going to look at is, if God has not given us properly basic belief of his existence, then how can we know he exists? So maybe Max, you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say something to clarify for viewers who may not know the terminology here, what's being meant. So yeah, an American philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, has tried to make the case over the course of a number of books and articles that one could have a belief in God that is rational, that constitutes knowledge, even though one doesn't base that belief on kind of arguments for God's existence. And so a belief that is that you're entitled rationally to hold, even though you don't hold that belief on the basis of arguments, is what's known as a properly basic belief. So Plantinga wants to say that belief in God, and actually even belief in the central Christian doctrines, Trinity, incarnation, atonement, resurrection, can be properly basic, that people can know that this is true even though they don't have any arguments. Now I don't accept that view. I think it's mistaken. So I'm what's known as an evidentialist, which is to say, I suppose the simplest way you could frame that is to say that the beliefs we hold should be held in proportion to the evidence that supports their truth. And so, yeah, I mean, the simple answer to Nathan's question is, how could we know that God exists? Well, this gets tricky as well, because exactly what we mean by knowledge is a heavily debated subject among philosophers, as all things. But so let me say first that we've got at least two concepts in play here. So there's kind of evidence and what the evidence supports, and then there's the concept of knowledge. I have to say I'm a lot more interested in the first concept, the concept of what the evidence supports. I'm not all that interested, to be honest, in the question of whether we can know things. Now, that sounds a bit weird, because the concept of knowledge, I know that the sun will rise tomorrow. In everyday discourse, the concept of knowledge obviously does feature quite heavily. I tend to think that that's more of a roundabout or an easy way of kind of referring to the idea that what we care about is evidence that supports our beliefs. And so I think, as I said, what I think is more important is the question of whether the evidence supports the truth of Christianity, rather than whether we can know that Christianity is true. And so I guess that then the way I'm wanting to answer Nathan's question is that I would prefer to focus on evidence rather than whether we can know that Christianity is true. So then the issue is, does the evidence support the truth of Christianity? I suppose I mean, there's so much to say there, and of course I can't do justice to it. Let me just say broadly how I'd approach that. I think firstly, we have to look at the evidence concerning what type of universe we're living in. Jonathan has alluded to some of that evidence, the evidence from things like fine tuning, the fact that the universe has a beginning and so on. And to skate over those enormous topics, I would I would say that I think on balance that evidence supports theism. So then the question is, well, so what specific kind of God are we talking about? And that's where I think then we can get into historical evidence, because the major monotheistic religions make specific claims about how God has been revealed in history. And again, skating over enormous issues, or rather, I mean, I think the evidence there very strongly supports the central claims of Christianity concerning Jesus, but there's a huge amount there that I can't go into. But I mean, I don't know if others want to expand on that, or if others have brief, succinct ways of summarizing some of the evidence. I'll probably hand over to someone else.
I will briefly describe or summarize the evidence for the resurrection in a nutshell, which is that there are 4 candidate hypotheses which purport to explain the relevant data. And I would maintain that these 4 categories of explanation are mutually exhaustive, meaning that they cover all of the possible candidate hypotheses for explaining the relevant data. Those are, number 1, that the apostles themselves didn't claim Jesus rose from the dead, and it's a later developing myth or legendary claim. Second hypothesis is that they did in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead, but they lied about it. Thirdly, they did in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead, but they were honestly misguided, mistaken about it. And fourthly, Jesus really did rise from the dead, which is the hypothesis which all of us on the panel subscribe to. On the first hypothesis that they didn't in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead, it's a later developing legend or myth. I think we can rule that out from numerous lines of evidence. Paul, for example, writing to the Corinthian Christians from Ephesus in the early to mid 50s AD, he in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, he mentions he passes on an oral creedal tradition concerning the beliefs of the early Jerusalem leaders and the apostles, and then he goes on to say that where then it was I or they, so we preach and so he believed, and so he thus assumes that the Corinthian Christians understand his proclamation of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Christ to be consistent with what's already being proclaimed to the Corinthian Christians by Peter and James and the apostles. And we have independent reason to think that the Corinthians were acquainted with Peter's preaching, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul chides the Corinthians for having divisions of factions in their midst. Some say I follow Apollos, others I follow Cephas, others I follow Paul, others I follow Christ. And so that suggests that indeed the Corinthians already heard this message of the gospel, the death, burial, resurrection of Christ from the other apostles. Furthermore, Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. And he actually claims to be a traveling companion of Paul because he uses the plural pronouns we from chapter 16 onwards. And there's very strong evidence, multiple lines of evidence that confirm that claim, I think. So, and in particular, Luke was with Paul upon Paul's visit to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 21, where Paul and Luke met with the Jerusalem elders, including James, and Luke was imprisoned with Paul in Caesarea, quite close to Jerusalem, for 2 years following that. And so Luke had ample access to that treasure trove of living witnesses to the bodily resurrection of Christ, and was thus in a position to be in the know as to what the apostles were claiming concerning that. And then you could also look at the Gospels as well as independent confirmation of what was being claimed. So that's the first hypothesis. Second hypothesis, that the apostles and lied about it. I think there's numerous evidences against that as well. One of which, probably the most popularly cited of those, is the fact that the disciples were willing to suffer and die for their convictions that Christ really rose from the dead, and that's what they saw. And liars typically make poor martyrs, and people will die for something they believe to be true, but very few people die for something that they know to be a lie. And the third hypothesis, that they were honestly mistaken, I think is argued against strongly by the fact that that the resurrection encounters, as described by the Gospels and Acts, were polymodal in character, involving multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. In according to Acts 1, it was extended across 40 days. And so it wasn't just one brief confusing episode. So if those really describe what was claimed by the apostles, it's very difficult to see how they could have been honestly mistaken by that. About that. And so the final hypothesis then that Jesus really did rise from the dead, I think, is the best account for all of the relevant data. So that's in a very succinct nutshell. Obviously, there's hours more that could be said on that topic. And the resurrection evidence is not even the only evidence for Christianity. There's all other levels of categories of evidence, such as the argument from predictive prophecy, for example, etc.
Jonathan, we've thanks so much for touching on those. I think the second point was talking about the martyrdom of many of the disciples. We've had another question through that links to that nicely, and I just wondered if we could touch on that. It's from Craig, and Craig's asking, I know that one of the biggest evidences for the resurrection is thought to be the apostles' willingness to be martyred for their faith, but how many of them were definitely martyred, and what was the historical sources do we have to confirm this? I know we touched on this in last week's conversation regarding the resurrection for about 2 hours, so I wonder if you can maybe touch on that again.
So the evidence for most of the apostles' deaths is quite limited. There are sources concerning the martyrdom of all of the apostles, with the exception of John, who the sources indicate died as an exile on the Isle of Patmos. However, most of the sources concerning the martyrdom of the apostles are late and clearly subject to legendary embellishment. However, we can make a strong argument for at least a few of the eyewitnesses that they met a martyr's death. For example, Peter, his martyrdom is attested by 2 first-century sources, not to mention multiple second-century sources as well. So the first-century sources would be Clement of Rome in his in First Clement, which was addressed to the Corinthian church. Most scholars date that to around AD 96. And in section 5, he mentions the martyrdom of Peter as well as Paul. And also John 21, which was, most scholars date the Gospel of John to 90 to 95 CE. And John, at the end of John's Gospel, in chapter 21, Jesus predicts ahead of time Peter's impending death and by crucifixion. And John specifically says that Jesus said this to indicate the way in which Peter was going to die, in which way he was going to glorify God, which is language that suggests martyrdom quite strongly. So, and if John was writing when most scholars think he was, towards the end of the 1st century, it seems very unlikely, if he was writing after Peter's martyrdom, that he would have, or Peter's death, that he would have attributed that prophecy to Jesus had it not actually happened in the way that he describes. Furthermore, the martyrdom of James, the Lord's brother, was also particularly well attested. For example, Flavius Josephus, who was not a Christian but rather a Jewish historian, in 20 of Antiquities of the Jews, mentions James's death by stoning. And in the Gospels, that's quite significant, because in the Gospels, the brothers of Jesus are portrayed as skeptics or non-believers in Jesus during his lifetime. In John 7 verse 5, it says, not even Jesus' own brothers believed in him. And then later in John 19, when he's on the cross, Jesus entrusts the care of his mother not to his own brother, but to the beloved disciple, which suggests or points in the direction of Jesus wanting his mother cared for by a believer, and Jesus' brothers were not believers during his lifetime. And yet very shortly after the resurrection, the brothers of Jesus are portrayed in the book of Acts, chapter 1, as praying alongside the disciples and Jesus' mother. And James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. We know from Acts as well. And 1 Corinthians 15 gives, I think, the best explanation, namely that Christ appeared to James. Peter, by the way, is also significant, because he was so afraid of crucifixion that he denied the Lord 3 times to save his own skin. And yet he later goes to his death as a martyr, even according to some sources, upside down at his own request, because he didn't feel himself worthy to be crucified in the same manner as the Lord. So, and then also James, the son of Zebedee, is also, his martyrdom is also recounted in the book of Acts, which is an early source. These are 3 individuals which I think we have good attestation for. And typically, when atheists or skeptics are arguing against this point about martyrdom, they can argue in one of 2 ways. One is to argue that, which is a more naive approach, that we have people even today that are willing to sacrifice for something that we know to be false, like muscles flying planes into buildings. That's a naive objection, because the difference is that the apostles are actually claiming to be witnesses to an event, and so they're in the position to know whether what they're claiming is true or not. The second objection, which is the more sophisticated way to argue for the atheist, is to cite some to raise doubts about the uniformity of the willingness of people or the unwillingness of people to die as martyrs for something that even they know to be false, and they'll typically cite some obscure counter examples or something along those lines. However, it's certainly, I think, undeniable that that the willingness of the apostles to suffer and die as martyrs is strong evidence, even if it's not proof. It's not a deductive proof, but it is nonetheless strong evidence for sincerity. It's more probable on the hypothesis of sincerity than on the hypothesis of deceit, and so it points, I think, powerfully in that direction. And by the way, even if we can't be certain about exactly how each of the apostles met their end, for the majority of them, we nonetheless can be sure that they were willing to suffer and die as martyrs, because there was intense persecution upon the early Christians, especially in the 60s AD, from AD 64, when Nero, according to Cornelius Tacitus, fastened the guilt and subject to the most exquisite torture as a class of people hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. And the reason that Tacitus gives us, the reason that Tacitus gives us for why Nero subjected the Christians to such persecution, is because there was a great fire in Rome in AD 64, and there was a rumor around that Nero had himself instigated the fire and set the city ablaze, and so he then blamed the Christians and took out his wrath upon them. And the Christians also were unwilling to confess Caesar as Lord, and instead had Christ as Lord. And since the resurrection was the center linchpin of their faith, I think we can be sure that that the resurrection was a core part of their testimony, something that the apostles were willing to die for.
Thanks, Jonathan. We're going to jump on to our next question now, which is just come in, and the question is, how do Christians respond to cancel culture? Christians are called to forgive one another in Ephesians 4:32, but where do we draw the line between being forgiving and being social doormat or calling out injustices within the church or sexual abuse? And just before someone goes into that question, I'm just going to outline very briefly what cancel culture is for those people who are unclear. It really generally refers to the popular practice of withdrawing support for public figures and companies after they've done or said something considered objectionable or offensive. It's generally discussed as being performed on social media or in the form of group shaming. So I wonder if someone wants to jump in on that.
Well, I think that I'll start off by talking about the forgiveness question. I think it's really important that we don't confuse the word forgiveness with consequence. God's forgiveness doesn't make sense. You know, when you think about the whole Christian story and Jesus coming and giving his life, it is an amazing story that every one of us who are guilty, if we trust in that, he forgives us. And I think that when we grasp the grace of God towards us, then we kind of can grasp how we can rationalize the forgiveness of other people. Now, the other thing I want to clarify, though, is that for anyone suffering any severe crime or abuse or any of these things, that, you know, God is heartbroken for you. And people who are guilty of these things, God is not saying that what they do doesn't matter. It does matter. That's why Jesus went to the cross, is because that's how much it matters. And so very much I would clarify that if people do these things, then as a society, we have to protect children, we have to protect the vulnerable, and people do need to face the consequences to their actions. But the offensiveness of Christianity is that anyone who genuinely turns to Christ, and that word genuinely is between them and God, God sees the heart, God sees if they're truly sorry, then that person will be forgiven. That is Christianity. Thanks,
Sarah. Does anyone else have anything to add on that? on that question? Because we have a similarly linked one that is kind of followed on from that. I hope that does help the person who's asked that. These are tough questions, and we're really appreciative of people sending them in both via the YouTube and the Zoom chat. So thank you very much. Please do continue to do that, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. The next question we're going to look at is just following on from that, which is what would you say to Christians who would like to speak out more publicly, but are worried that their past will cancel them in the future, which could include possibly putting their vocation at risk? I personally know a number of people who have been kind of made redundant or sacked, in various situations, and I just wondered if anyone had anything they could add to that.
Can you just clarify the question, David? Is the question saying if you've done things in your past that you can't speak out about your Christian faith?
I think the person asking is thinking they're worried that their past will mean that they can't maybe stand, and talk about scripture, or have a ministry maybe in the future, because that could be one, or the other part that could be, can they have a vocation where they speak openly but then still maintain their job? As I've said, I have a number of examples of friends who are in the teaching profession and other professions who I think Callum may have some stories in the medical profession as well of different people who've maybe tried to be true to their faith but then have come up against the law, or also there are other medical professionals who are calling them out in various topics. So it's a big thing to look at. But if anyone did have anything they wanted to throw in there, that'd be valuable.
Yeah, I think there's different sides to that question that's getting asked. I think probably what I would start off by the angle of it that's saying about your past and going forward. There's no one that hasn't done wrong things. So no one speaks out as a Christian because you are the person that just justifies yourself, and therefore you can speak as a Christian. We are all able to identify as Christians because of Jesus. He is the one who's forgiven us. That is what empowers us to speak. And as far as I can see when I read the Bible, it is full of characters who have pasts and things that they wish hadn't happened in the past, and they're used by God. I think what I personally would advise for anyone in that situation is trust God with where he will take you. If you're worried about God using you, if you're worried about wanting to share faith, talk to God about that, because do you think that he won't want you to do that? If you hand it over to him, I truly believe that he will raise you up in his time, and he will lead you into the right thing. I think, David, the other angle that you were coming at with that question is, when you're true to your faith, it can have consequences. And I think we have to be real that the Bible talks about this. You may lose your job, you may face persecution. Some people are facing much more than what we're faced with here in the UK. And so I think we have to be faithful to what God is telling us to do. Christianity is not a private faith. It is a public sharing where we do tell our friends and we do invite our colleagues to know about Jesus. And again, I really think that's another matter where we've got to trust God and instead of outcomes. Don't make a decision based on, will this happen, will that happen? Is God telling you to share your faith? Well, leave the outcomes and the consequences to him. It's easy said, I appreciate, and it's really, really difficult.
Thanks. I think that was really, really helpful in just unpacking those two angles there. I don't, if no one else has any further things to add to that, we'll go to our next question, which someone's asked: can a Christian lose their salvation? And I wonder if that's something that we could unpack a bit. If anyone had any thoughts on that.
So I'll take that then. I don't think any Christian can lose their salvation. And again, this might be an issue on which panelists disagree. I don't know the perspective of people on the panel on this. But I personally don't think that Christians can lose their salvation. If we go over to, and there's numerous passages that we could get into, and we certainly can't do it justice, unfortunately. But in John 6, verse 44, it says, Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. And so those that are drawn to the Father get raised up. He goes on, and also actually before that, he says, verse 39 of John 6, and this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. This is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. I'd also cite Romans 8:29, where actually, if you look at verse 28 and 29, it says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And then verse 29, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. And so that seems to suggest that there's this unbroken chain of redemption, right from the act of foreknowledge of God to the ultimate justification and glorification. So I personally think that a Christian cannot lose their salvation. And however, I think that and one illustration that I would draw, because Scripture does teach that that salvation is conditional upon perseverance, and there are many passages which talk about salvation being conditional upon perseverance. The book of Hebrews, for example, has multiple passages to that effect. However, Philippians 1 actually says that he who began a good work and you will finish it and bring it through to completion. And at the day of Jesus Christ. And Philippians 1 verse 6 says that he who began a good work and you will finish it and bring it through to completion, suggesting that once you're saved, then God will ultimately bring about the sanctification. You would also have to say, by the way, that if we can lose our salvation, then the Son is praying prayers that are not answered, because the Son, as our mediator, is making intercessory prayers before the Father. And if we can lose our salvation, then you would have to say that the Son is interceding on our behalf, but the Father is rejecting the Son's prayer request, which I think is theologically problematic. Last point I'll make is that, so I mentioned that Scripture does teach that salvation is conditional upon perseverance. In the book of Acts in 27, we have Paul's shipwreck, and I think this is a good illustration for how this works. And Paul is told by an angel that that no one will perish, that everyone will be spared from the shipwreck. And yet Paul tells the sailors on that boat that you must remain with the ship in order to be saved. So their salvation is already guaranteed by God. Nonetheless, their salvation is contingent and conditional upon them staying with the boat. So I would maintain that although salvation is conditional upon perseverance, God fulfills that condition in causing us to persevere. So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but I'll leave it at that. If anyone wants to disagree with me on that on the panel, then feel free to give your own perspective.
We're all happy with that? Okay. One question that's come in from Kyle, that it was coming quite early actually. So thank you for being so patient, Kyle. There's been so many questions come in. We're just getting through them slowly. So one question that came in that you asked was, are there any topics or methods of presentation that you think apologists can improve on? And I think obviously there's a handful of us just on the call, the panel this evening, and obviously many who are looking to answer the big questions that many people have. So I'm just wondering if the panel have any thoughts on that. You know, being humans, being people that aren't perfect, there are things we can all improve on. But I wondered if there were any specific kind of topics. We all have our own niche kind of area, but I wonder if there was any kind of topics that we thought could be kind of expanded on. Bless you, Callum. If you guys wanted to throw something out there, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think that that I think Christians can do more work on, I guess we're talking about content rather than methods of delivery at this point.
I would say let's focus on kind of topics, content.
Yeah. So I think one area in which Christians could do more work is on the moral objections to the Bible. I think that that's so some of these issues are quite challenging and require some detailed analysis to work through, and I think there could be more books and more perspectives on that topic. There's obviously there's a lot of things that are often overlooked on that topic. For example, in the book of Exodus 21, when God is speaking about his when he's talking about the conquest, he says that he's sending hornets and angels ahead of the people of Israel into the land, and he won't drive them out within a year, but slowly but surely he will drive out the people of the land using hornets and angels. This is also spoken of in Exodus 33, and so God actually I'm sorry, not Exodus 21, Exodus 23. Exodus 23 and Exodus 33. It says, verse 28, I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hivites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you, until you have received and possessed the land, until you've increased and possessed the land. Exodus 33 also makes the same point. It says, verse 2, I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. So God actually says that he sends angels and hornets ahead of the people of Israel to evacuate the people of the land, so that when the people of Israel come there to take the land, then the number of personnel in the land of Canaan is substantially reduced. So there's a lot more that could be said on that. There's a lot of another point that people often overlook when talking about moral objections to the Old Testament is that there's a popular presumption that it's always wrong to kill or take the lives of innocent people. And I can think of thought experiments or scenarios where it's more ambiguous as to whether it's wrong to take the lives of innocent people. One illustration that Peter J. Williams of Tyndale House in Cambridge puts forward, which I think is quite good, is quite apt, is in 9/11, there were fighter jets that were scrambled to intercept the planes that were on their way to their targets. There was the Flight 93, which was headed towards DC, possibly the White House or the Capitol building, was hijacked, and so there were fighter planes that were scrambled to intercept, and they had no weapons on board, so they would have to actually, it was a suicide mission. They would have to actually take both themselves and the passengers of that plane out, and they never actually got there because the passengers on the plane took control. They fought off the terrorists and crashed the airplane, and everyone on the plane died, but it didn't meet its target. But supposing that they had actually intercepted the plane successfully, then okay, so you've got two individuals. You've got the terrorists who are flying their plane into a building to kill and massacre lots of people, and a collection of innocent people, and you have the Air Force pilots who are also intent in flying their plane into a collection of innocent people and taking their lives. One of them, if they'd succeeded, would have been hailed as a hero. The other, of course, is a moral monster. So clearly, it's not always clear whether it's morally wrong to take the lives of innocent people. However, as Peter J. Williams points out, there's a moral vulnerability in this thought experiment, and that is that supposing that they had succeeded in intercepting that plane, then the relatives of those that had died on that plane might have protested and said, but you don't know what was going on that plane. They might have taken control of the plane. Everyone might have lived. You don't know what was going on, and that is so. But when it comes to God, God is omnipotent and God is omniscient. He's all knowing, and so he knows exactly what's in everyone's heart. He knows exactly the future and he knows exactly the counterfactuals of the future. He knows what's going to happen. And so if God is omniscient and he knows all things, and he's he knows exactly what's going to happen if these people of the land of Canaan are allowed to live, then I think it's more ambiguous as to, or it's more difficult to judge God's characters or make a moral critique of God's actions if we don't have access to that same information that God has access to. So that all to say that I think that the issue of the moral objections in the Old Testament is one of the more difficult issues which Christians have to grapple with, and I think there could be a lot more books and papers exploring that topic. But there are also a lot of things that people overlook in relation to that topic, which I think make the problem less difficult than it initially appears to be.
Thanks, Jonathan. Does anyone else have any kind of topics that they think are maybe overlooked, or we can just touch on briefly before we jump on to our next question? If not, no problem. If everyone's happy with that. Cool. The next question we want to just bring up is, and yeah, Mike Roberts, no problem. Thanks for those questions. They're really helpful and insightful. So thanks for sending those great questions in. The next question is to Callum specifically. Callum, obviously a medical doctor. Maybe you could just speak into this briefly for us. What is the mistake that you think maybe Christians make in debating the abortion topic? It's a very hotly debated conversation. It's one I think we're going to have in a lot more detail in a few weeks' time. But could you just give us an overview of that, maybe?
Yeah, I guess it really depends. I think there's probably not just one mistake. Even as someone who's kind of academic expertise and mostly public speaking expertise now is on this topic, I still make tons of mistakes. And so I think Christians as a whole will make a huge number. I think one of the things I often say first in presentations, especially when training other people to be public speakers on this, is that abortion is so extraordinarily common. We know that probably about 1 in 3 women in the UK, and is broadly similar in other countries, in developed countries certainly, about 1 in 3 women in their lifetimes will have an abortion, and probably about half of those will have more than one abortion, which means that actually, if you're speaking to kind of a group of people, or if you're speaking kind of on video, for example, where there's going to be an audience of more than a handful of people, in pretty much every context where more than a handful of people hear you, it's very likely that someone listening to you will have had an abortion. And I think when that's the case, it's quite easy to see, I think, how a lot of either pro-life kind of advocates or Christians can speak without really thinking in their minds, actually, I'm speaking to someone, or someone is listening who has had an abortion. And so one of the things that I think probably is most lacking is not even a particular argumentative strategy or a particular claim that they make that's false, but actually is just a failure to constantly be thinking throughout every interaction all the time, how would I feel if this person, how would I feel if I had had an abortion and I was listening to me? And I think that's something that is obviously difficult to keep in mind constantly, especially when you get into more difficult philosophical questions and things. And I struggle and sometimes answer without compassion. But I think that's probably one of the main pitfalls that I see and that I experience. That's not to say that I think Christians in general are kind of horrible when it comes to this topic, or that they speak insensitively. I actually think pro-lifers and Christians are really badly misrepresented. I think when you look at how the media portrays pro-lifers, the sense you get is that they're all very judgmental, horrible people who really don't care and just want to condemn people. And while that's true in some cases, I actually think that's extremely rare among the vocal pro-life movement. And I'm wary that I really don't want to kind of jump on that media bandwagon and unfairly denigrate pro-lifers. So I wouldn't say that it's kind of a pervasive lack of empathy that pro-lifers and Christians kind of have when it comes to abortion. But I do think it's one of the hardest things to constantly keep in mind. There will be other things, I think, on most topics, people are prone to make exaggerations. One example is the mental health kind of costs of abortion. I think the evidence is pretty clear that abortion is linked with kind of some mental health problems. But I think the effect is not as exaggerated as some pro-lifers might say. So I think the increase in certain mental disorders after having an abortion is significant, and it certainly should be told to women, and is often a persuasive reason not to have an abortion. But I don't think it's the case that like every single woman has enormous kind of mental difficulties because of abortion. So I think sometimes Christians can exaggerate their claims. Likewise, you know, I think pro-lifers in general, whether Christian or not, probably don't respond to some objections that well. The objection I think that Christians really badly, or pro-lifers really badly respond to most of the time is, you might have heard of it, it's the burning lab scenario, where essentially the idea is posited that a lab is on fire and you can either save a child or you can save a embryo in an IVF test tube or whatever. And the thought is that most people would save the baby, and that shows that they don't really think the baby and the embryo are equal. I think most Christian responses to this and most pro-life responses to this aren't very good, frankly. I think there are good responses to it, but I think most pro-lifers haven't done a very good job of really getting to the heart of that disagreement. So there are a number of kind of areas where I think pro-lifers haven't always done a great job. But I also would, I think, emphasize that I do think they're unfairly maligned when they're kind of portrayed as constantly judgmental or condemning or harsh. I actually think that's just not true of the large majority of active pro-lifers. So I hope that gives just a few kind of ideas. I don't think there's any one major thing that Christians kind of generally get wrong. I think it's more there's a few areas where people are prone to make more mistakes, and those mistakes are a mix of factual mistakes and relational mistakes. But on the whole, I actually don't think they're that common. Yeah.
Thanks, Callum. Yeah, we're going to move on to the next question there. Really helpful. These are big questions, and just thanks so much to the person, the people asking those questions. No questions. Every question is welcome. The next question we're going to just look at is quite a topical one, and this has been spoken about by a number of people, as many will have seen. John Lennox has spoken into this, John Piper. There's many speakers across the world that are looking into this topic at the moment. And the question is, why doesn't God stop the coronavirus? There's been obviously a number of books already coming out about this, short books that are looking to help look at this question. And I wondered if some of our panelists could maybe touch on some thoughts on this, and then we're going to close off with our next three questions that are going to bring the Q&A panel discussion to a close this evening. So this next question is, why doesn't God stop the coronavirus? Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Might be helpful to put it into a wider perspective of suffering in general, where we will face all kinds of suffering in this life. It's going to, viruses, other illnesses, personal situations, global situations, and there will be other challenges after coronavirus. And so it's probably helpful to put it into this wider lens of suffering. And I think we have to realize that we are in a fallen world where all kinds of suffering can happen. I just think it's really important as Christians that we don't look at a global pandemic like this and think, well, God's just absent. He's just allowing this chaos. He's uninterested and unvested. Whenever, God, nothing takes him by surprise. He's still in control. He's still got a plan, and he's got a plan for the whole world. He's going to bring the new heavens and the new earth. He's going to restore creation. And he's also got a plan for each and every person. And so what I would actually say is, in the midst of the suffering, where are you going to turn to? one of the things that I've really thought about being under the lockdown measures has been, I've been so thankful for my Christian faith, because I do think in those moments where I become more stressed, I turn to God, and you have that rock, you have something immovable. And so I just would really encourage people in these measures to think, is this situation actually God's mercy to you? You know, is he actually saying those things that you've been putting your hope in, that you can't currently experience, or maybe pointing to the fact that we're supposed to trust something way deeper? And so I would very much invite you to look at the face of Christ, who knows what suffering is all about. He came to this earth, he died on the cross, he can relate to everything that we face, and I believe that he wants to be with us in this situation.
I would also add on that, I have a few points in relation to suffering more broadly. One is that it's okay as Christians to say, I don't know. I don't think that we have a full perspective on the issue of suffering. I think certainly we can begin to understand certain aspects of it. We can begin, there's a whole field of theodicy which attempts to account for and explain the reality of suffering in our world in light of a Christian worldview. I think that we can begin to understand some of it at a broader level, but certainly individual levels of suffering, why God allows those to happen in the world. I think we just don't know. And so I think it's okay as Christians to be honest and upfront and say that. There's a phenomenon in psychology known as the need for cognitive closure, which is that certain people, in order to be satisfied and content in their worldview, that require all the answers to every conceivable question. And I think there's no shame in having unanswered questions, because we should, I think, not get so fixated on the questions which we don't have a full and complete answer to, that we miss the forest for the trees and miss the avalanche of positive confirmatory evidence for Christianity. I would also say that suffering, the argument from suffering, I think, is subject to what I call evidential entanglement. And what I mean by that is that suffering itself, you might look at it and suffering. You might look at suffering and see it as more probable on atheism than on theism, and therefore evidence for atheism over theism. I would be more inclined to see it as evidence for theism over atheism, because even if suffering in the world is highly improbable given the hypothesis of theism, I think it's still far more probable on theism than it is on atheism, because suffering itself presupposes certain things which have been historically and traditionally used as points of leverage in arguments for the existence of God, such as consciousness, for example. Suffering presupposes conscious, sentient, subjective experience, something which I think is far more probable on theism than it is on atheism, not to mention it requires a universe and moral agents and so forth, which I think makes far better sense on theism than on atheism. So even though suffering is very, very improbable on theism, one could make that argument, I think nonetheless, it is still far more probable on theism than it is on atheism. And thus it is evidence, in fact, for theism over atheism. And one final point I'll make is that even if we don't fully understand the reasons for suffering in the world, even if suffering is evidence for atheism over theism, there's evidence on both sides of the balance all the time. So we have to adjudicate and evaluate competing cumulative cases: the positive confirmatory cumulative case for Christianity, and the positive confirmatory or disconfirmatory case that, and one might bring to bear suffering on that. And when we're adjudicating and evaluating multiple competing cumulative cases, I think that we have to bear in mind that one cumulative case in this instance has not only extensive evidence, but also evidence in multiple categories, evidence of different kinds. Whereas evidence of suffering are fundamentally evidences of the same category or kind. And so if let's say we find the first instance of suffering in the world, and let's say that it has a Bayes factor of 100, meaning that it's 100 times more probable on atheism than on theism, and so it's showing its evidence for atheism over theism, it doesn't follow that the second piece of evidence of suffering in the world carries the same evidential weight. Because if God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting instance 1 of suffering in the world, he might well have a similar morally sufficient reason for permitting instance 2, and instance 3, instance 4, and so forth. Whereas the virtue of the positive confirmatory case for Christianity is that it's multiple lines of evidence of different categories which bear on that case. And so having so you need multiple alternative explanations to explain each of the relevant facts in question for that case. So I think that one should prefer the positive confirmatory cumulative case for theism rather than the competing cumulative case brought to bear by atheists from suffering.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that. The next question, and our penultimate question for the evening, is a question really about predestination. And the question is from our friend at the start of the evening, actually. Thank you for sending this in. It's how can we have free will when God knows the future? So I'm wondering if maybe Max and Sarah could maybe touch on this, if that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just lay out a few options really, because I don't particularly know exactly where I stand on this. So, I mean, the first thing to say is there's two different conceptions of free will in play in philosophy. I mean, basically it boils down to two. So one is called a libertarian conception. That's kind of your common sense conception of free will, which says that you're free just in case an action that you perform, comes from your will, your character, and you had the power to do otherwise. So you could have not done the thing that you did, and that was a genuine possibility for you at the time when you did it. So, but then there's also something called the compatibilist conception of free will that says that you can be free even if all your actions ultimately are sort of fixed ahead of time by the laws of nature or whatever, so long as you do what you want to do. So the compatibilist kind of slogan for free will is you're free as long as you do what you want to do, even if what you want to do is in fact determined. So that's one thing to kind of lay on the table first. I suspect the person asking the question is wanting to know how we can have libertarian free will if God knows the future. So basically, you really have a couple of different options here. You've got a view known as Molinism, which basically says that the way that this works is that God has something called middle knowledge. So middle knowledge is this knowledge of what we freely would do in any possible situation we could be in. So including situations that we never will actually be in. So a situation in which I was offered, a bribe of £1 million to give one of my students a first-class grade on one of their essays. There's a truth about what I would do in that situation. And the idea is that God knows all of these truths about what we would do in any possible situation. And then, so the way that God knows the future is that he sees which situations we will end up in, and then he combines that with his knowledge of what we would do freely in those situations, and then he deduces what will actually happen. But the thought is that's completely compatible with the thing that we freely do. It really is flowing from us, and it's not causally predetermined. So that's how the Molinist tries to hold the two together. The other position is known as simple foreknowledge, and it just says that, if you like, that there isn't a mechanism by which God sort of plugs in this piece of knowledge and this piece of knowledge and deduces the answer that this is what's going to happen. God just knows in a kind of immediate fashion, I suppose some people might find that unsatisfying because they want to know, well, no, what is the mechanism by which God knows these future truths? I don't see that as a really decisive objection, I guess, because I think if we're talking about an omnipotent being, why should it be the case that there has to be some kind of mechanism in the way that, you know, if we want to arrive at knowledge of the future, it's obvious that we have to go through some kind of inferential procedure where we plug in stuff that we know about the present in combination with some laws and whatever, and we sort of turn the crank and get an answer to what we think is going to happen. But why should it be the case that an unlimited being like God has to go through a procedure like that? So yeah, I mean, so this view that I'm sketching now is known as the simple foreknowledge view, and it says that that there is no kind of mechanism that we can unpack as to how God knows the future, but it just is the case that God knows what's going to happen at any future time, and that includes future genuinely free actions in the libertarian sense that creatures perform.
Max, thanks for that. I'm just wondering, could you, if people want to do any further reading, are there any kind of books or papers you would recommend, just as a kind of starter for people who've asked that question? Maybe Sarah, if you have some thoughts, Max can come back to you. Max, Sarah, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I think I'd probably put on my teacher hat here and say I teach A-level philosophy of religion. I actually think the most wonderful thing is to go and get like an A-level textbook that goes through, you know, the structure of all of these theories at an accessible level. And I think then once you have that house built, then it's much easier then to maybe go into a philosopher specifically and read that bit deeper. I think the only thing that I would add to Max, who's kind of explained all the philosophical options, would be to ground it again relationally, because the Christian God that we're interacting with, he wants us to love him through choice. So whenever I ground it relationally, I get less stuck about what's his will, what's my will. If it's a relationship, then he wants my heart, he wants my mind, he wants me to choose. And that makes me meaningful, that makes my choices meaningful. But I also think even when I do a thought experiment in my head, if my choices were the only ones that counted and God had nothing to do with them, I probably would flip out with my personality, because I'd be thinking, this could happen, that could happen. So I very much value relationship where I can trust him and his decisions and his choices and what he's in control of, but I know that mine are meaningful.
Thanks, Sarah, for that. Friends, that is going to bring us to our final question, which is basically really looking at materials for people who want to maybe dig in a bit more to some of these topics. So I'm just going to ask the other panelists, I'll give a few suggestions and then I'll hand it over before we close out the evening. But for those of us who are looking for a touch more detail on these sorts of topics, which kind of books would you look to recommend to answer some of the questions? So the kind of key areas: that does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Looking at the resurrection. Is the Bible the inspired word of God? So I'll just kick off. There's two books I'd recommend for Did Jesus Rise from the Dead on the Resurrection that I'd point people to as a starter. Gary Habermas and Mike Licona write a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. I'd recommend that as a starter. And also another classic, William Lane Craig, looking at the historical argument for the resurrection. Those are two as kind of starters in that field. I wonder if the other panelists maybe can suggest maybe a couple of books for the other two topics. That'd be helpful before we close off.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Max.
Oh, you sure, John? I'll yeah, I mean, Richard Swinburne, Is There a God? So that's a kind of slightly popularized version of his more scholarly book, which is The Existence of God. I would highly recommend that as a kind of grand case that uses probability theory for theism. And then there's a more recent book by a philosopher called Josh Rasmussen called How Reason Leads to God. It's also very good.
Thanks, Max. Jonathan, did you have one?
Yeah, on the resurrection, I recommend an older book called The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, an Historical Fact with an Examination of Naturalistic Hypotheses by John Kennedy. So that's a good book on the resurrection of Jesus. David, did you mention Lacona's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and used a historiographical approach? Because it's.
I think that was the one I meant. No, I mentioned another one with Gary Habermas.
I knew you mentioned that one. I can remember if you mentioned the other one as well. I recommend that. Also, J. Warner Wallace's books at a more popular level. So here's a book called. I'm trying to remember his book on the resurrection. It's called Alive. His book on the resurrection is called Alive. Also, he's written a number of books on cold case evidence, or cold case approach to arguing for the Gospels, such as cold case Christianity and God's crime scene, etc. That's at the more popular level beginner book. On the reliability of the New Testament in particular, I highly recommend Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, as well as her newer book, The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, and her forthcoming book, which is The Eye of the Beholder, which is making the case for the historical reliability of the Gospel of John. And I also recommend, as one of the greatest apologetics books of all time, William Paley's A View of the Evidence of Christianity, and also his book Hora Paulinae, which means, translated from the Latin, the Times of Paul, which makes a case for the reliability of the Book of Acts, based upon undesigned coincidences between the Pauline corpus and the Book of Acts. And I also recommend Colin Hemer's commentary on the Book of Acts, called The Book of Acts and the Ascending of Hellenistic History, as well as Craig Keener's 4-volume set on the Book of Acts, if you're interested in making the case for the reliability of that. Richard Balcomb's book as well on the Gospels as eyewitness testimony, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I don't agree with everything in the book, as one seldom does, but it's a really great piece of work making the case for the reliability of the gospel accounts. On the existence of God, there's numerous books one could read. Douglas Groothuis's book called Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith, I recommend, as well as the book that Will and Craig co-authored with J.P. Moreland, called Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, as well as the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology is also a good, more scholarly, technical level book on the existence of God. So there's just a few books off the top of my head that I'd recommend.
Fantastic. Jonathan and Max and everyone, thanks so much for those book suggestions. I'm sure the listeners have got probably a year's worth of reading there to start off with. But yeah, thanks so much to all the listeners who've whether you've been on YouTube or on the Zoom webinar. Thanks so much for everyone who's sent in their questions and participated. It's been great. I hope you've enjoyed the evening, and I just wanted to just say that Jonathan McClatchy runs a ministry called Apologetics Academy, and so if there are any questions that you do want to email through, then feel free to email through to him on his website, and I'm sure he'll be able to put them through to the different panelists if there were specifically to any of them. So that leaves me just with one thing just to finalize. Just thank you to all the rest of the panel. It's been a great evening, and thank you for your time. I think this will be something that is reoccurring. There'll be something maybe in the coming months, and so we look forward to spending time looking at more of the big questions around Christianity and the Bible, and just say thank you very much again for all the questions. So I think without further ado, we'll close the evening there and the Q&A, and thanks to everyone who's taken part and the panelists as well. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.